Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Stacey Plaskett, Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, and it's our Saturday morning coffee, bush tea, whatever it is you like to drink. Um, we decided to do this every other week. I didn't want it to get stale with you all. And so doing it as a live broadcast on Saturday mornings also means that sometimes I do get to sleep in, although I really rarely can stay in the bed beyond 7 a.m. After that, I feel I can hear my mother in my ear telling me how you're behind up, get the day started, don't let the sun catch you in your bed. So I guess I've been conditioned after so many years to actually get up early. Although I'm not, I remember when Jonathan and I lived in LaGrange, I could hear people at 4 o'clock in the morning walking in the morning down the road from Fleming down to down by the down that road going to the fort. And I'll tell you, that was right when I was getting my best sleep. And sometimes I'd say hello, but more often than not, just roll over. But this month, it's a really important month, is Mental Health Month. And I thought it was incredibly important to discuss that with you all, that we are having this month, and discuss the issues that we all face in our own mental health. We take some of us take such incredible care of our bodies, but do not take care of our mind and our emotions. And so I really wanted to spend some time talking with some people who have dedicated themselves to that endeavor, to taking care of the health of the Black community, of our people, and those who often do not seek mental health, but more often than not really need it because of the stressors that we have in our community. The Black community in the United States has been disproportionately affected by so many things, and I believe that the coronavirus has revealed that. It's not caused it, it's just a revealing disease that has shown things that were already there. The Black community is faced with a lot of stress, I believe, and has impacted them both structural, limited resources, interpersonal, disruption of shared resources, and individual, compromised coping levels. Wealth disparities between Black communities and others are stark, such that less disposable income and generational wealth diminish the amount of resources that can be affected in combating COVID, right? So, for example, one's ability to stay home requires a certain type of job or a specific amount of liquidity in your income to stay at home out of harm's way. Yet many Black citizens have jobs that require them to interact with others in various industries, putting them at an increased exposure. I had the real pleasure of being on a talk in the beginning of last week, the middle of last week, about mental health and health in Black women. And there were some amazing statistics which really brought that to bear. So Black women have jobs, our top 3 jobs are jobs that put us most in risk of the COVID pandemic. We are nurses' aides, we are cashiers at grocery stores, and then we are customer service representatives. Those are the top 3 professions that you find Black women in. And then when you talk about disposable income, who has saved enough money to be able to stay at home if your job doesn't allow it? Or even if you're applying for unemployment, waiting for that unemployment check to come in some places is a month, 2 months because of the number of claims that are there. So I saw a statistic that said that white single men have $28,900 saved and wealth, and have wealth, income that they can tap into. White women have $15,000. Black women have $200. And even less so, Hispanic women have $100 saved up. So the primary strength that Black communities have is our communalism, our role sharing, our tight-knit families, and they're hampered by efforts to distance and keep the most vulnerable safe. So all of those stressors interplay, meaning that they have short-term and long-term issues, but certainly the longer we need to remain isolated, the more each of these problems, the problems that we have, will be compounded. Let's not even talk about racism as a stressor that impact Black Americans on a daily basis. Various acts of racial discrimination, whether separate or part of a larger systemic pattern, have been linked to feelings of being unsafe within their own and other communities. So I have two people on right now that I want to bring on who are going to talk about this with us this morning. We are going to talk with, and I'm going to read this because I don't want to get it wrong, okay? I want to be able to really give them their props. So we have Dr. Tony Spann, who is the Chief Clinical Officer with Henry Health here in Washington, D.C. Henry Health is a culturally intentional behavioral health provider. They deliver teletherapy services and curate an ecosystem of digital communities to help people live their best lives. Men Thrive is the inaugural digital community powered by Henry Health. Throughout the years, Dr. Tony Spann has aspired to become a dynamic clinician and professional in the community. Dr. Tony Spann's desire have been to turn his raw passion for helping others into professional art that benefits the public at large. Then we have our own homegrown Tariq McMillan. Tariq is a mental health counselor and entrepreneur with a desire to meaningfully address the mental health crisis that affects Virgin Islanders and surrounding Caribbean communities. Mr. McMillan is experienced with counselors because he was unable to connect with them at a younger age, and that fueled his desire to work in this field. During his master's program in Pittsburgh, he worked at the Bradley Center, a residential treatment facility that specializes in addressing the needs of children with behavioral health diagnosis, many of whom experience physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. He was immersed in working with trauma and gave valuable insight into the many ways that traumatic experiences can develop and create barriers to normal functioning. After coming home in 2017, September of that year, when the hurricanes hit, there was an overwhelm, it overwhelmed not only our physical infrastructure, but the community's ability to cope with the stress that post-hurricane life would inevitably bring. In 2019, he partnered with Virgin Islands counselor Tamara Mohammed and founded Greater Changes, a behavioral health agency that provides information about mental health as well as individual, family, couples, and group counseling in the Virgin Islands as well as Central Florida. So thank you, gentlemen, for being on the show.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you for having us, Congresswoman.
Great. Let me start. Tariq, I'm going to let age go first. Seniority in Congress, you know, sometimes I have to roll my eyes at how much I always have to defer to seniority, but I'm going to make you do it this morning as well a little bit. So Dr. Spann, talk a little bit about what you have been seeing that's happening in the Black community during this pandemic.
And thank you for asking this question because it allows voices that may not have been heard before to speak. So as a practicing clinician and chief clinical officer of Henry Health, we have Black men that are on our platform right now that we work with. And I particularly want to tell a story about working with one of our pastors that's on the front lines. And so this is also a frontline responder that we may not think about a lot, but within the Black community, we know the Black church is so important and it helps to guide, and it's a protective factor and a supportive factor. But what about our leaders within the churches? What about our spiritual leaders? And so right now within the DC metro area, we do have a lot of fatalities, particularly African Americans. And so as a pastor, he's having to go out there and continuously support his congregation, continuously support his members. And that's a lot on him. So at Henry Health, we're working with him, looking at his intersecting stories, making sure that he allows space for his own compassion, his own rest, so that he continues to be a spiritual leader. And I find that that is a narrative that is unspoken between Black men, unspoken narrative sometimes within the African American community, as we're still working through this pandemic, but at the same time on front lines, as you mentioned, women in spaces where it's not always talked about or honored or cherished, but we are making a difference during this time. And so I think with him finding respite in therapy and having that conversation with me allows for him to find a space to rejuvenate, to re-energize. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, stay our healthiest during this time so that we can continue to make a difference in our own lives and the lives of others.
That's awesome. Tariq, how has your work having to deal with the hurricanes of 2017 in the Virgin Islands, how has that impacted, and how have you used that in helping people cope through the COVID pandemic?
Right. So back in 2017, right after the hurricane, I did crisis counseling, and a lot of what I saw was the fear of how am I gonna repair my home? How am I gonna deal with the anxiety that I feel? And maybe not saying the word anxiety exactly, because they didn't have the language. Most people that I saw didn't have the language to describe it. But it was most, I feel weird. I don't know what this is. So now, fast forward to the pandemic, I guess I'm a little more accustomed to, especially working back home, people not having the language to describe accurately that this isn't, it's not just that I feel weird, I feel anxious, I feel nervous. And when working with men, I found that it's difficult for us to describe what we feel as fear sometimes, right? And something else that I think is really important to note, usually when I start my work, I start with meditation. I start, hey, how about we slow down, we calm down, we use some deep breathing to center ourselves. And it's kind of hard when one of those strategies is to maybe let's take a long walk, or let's go someplace and just be, when everywhere around you is potential for a risk of contact with COVID. So it's really being innovative in how we address, how we meditate, how we use any kind of mindfulness tactics to deal with stress.
I found that fascinating when you said they didn't have the language. Do you both find that it's hard to, how do you help people identify, their anxiety and their concerns with their mental and emotional state of being?
And good question, Congresswoman. And I think the way that I would do it, and I also hope to hear from Tariq as well, is just as you touched your body. So there's a lot of sensory when we think about our bodies. And sometimes we may not know as much about the visceral, which is our feelings and emotions, but sometimes we can talk about our bodies. Do I feel tension? Am I feeling jittery? Am I feeling exhausted? Am I feeling sleepy or restless? Those may be some more tangential body physical moments that you're able to see. But then we can also go into some of the more simpler feelings, like, are you feeling worried, as Tariq was mentioning, or are you feeling upset? And then maybe we can bring in some more vocabulary and getting into more of the social and emotional feelings or aspects. But maybe starting with maybe a body scan, as Tariq was mentioning, with meditation, and then going into some of the words. I don't know if Tariq, maybe you have something?
Yeah. So what I've found is, I think sometimes as clinicians, we have this habit of going to a level and expecting our clients to get there. Then we have no real expectation, no real accurate reason why we should expect that they should have that language. So I use the language that they have already incorporated into their daily lives. So back home, I remember the first time having a client from back home, and he said, "Man, I just feel away, And when was the last time you felt that?" And then we could link how they feel in this moment to different ways they felt in the past, and we draw connections, and then we can start to incorporate. Well, is it concern? Is it worry? And if they feel comfortable enough to get there, and then we say, it almost sounds like a little bit like fear. Is it close to that? So maybe not like, so kind of dancing around the language until they feel comfortable enough to jump in.
Mm-hmm. What do you find is the difference in how you, how women present themselves to you than men? And how do they even come to receive treatment with you all, as you know, as in the difference in the genders? So, and the reason I ask that, let me just preface that with my own experience, is that so many of the Black men that I know that do get mental health treatment, it's because their wives or family members are pushing them to do it. And I find that more often than not, those same women in those relationships are not getting it, and using the excuse that they really don't have the time, that they are taking care of others. And I wondered how those that do present, it's usually, to me, I find that my female friends that do end up going, it's because there's a crisis with someone else in their family that leads them to therapy. But you guys tell me your experience.
Right. So,
yeah. No, go ahead, Tariq.
So usually, and I took this multicultural class in grad school, and one thing that always stuck with me was the professor saying it's important that you address whatever may be uncomfortable between you and your client, right? So a lot of times my clients, or the female clients that I see, I ask, hey, so I know that the things that you've been through have been at the hands of another guy. Me being another guy, how does that make you feel having this interaction? And usually it's, well, I didn't even think about that. But when it's been a thought prior to the session starting, they're like, I was really afraid that this would be an issue. I'm happy that you brought it up. You know, so it's not this like sweeping it under the rug kind of thing that may happen with some of the clinicians.
And with men, how do they come to you, and how do you have a different way of dealing with them? What's your cultural sensitivity with that?
Yeah. So when I speak with men, it's a completely different. Like, even I noticed it when Dr. Span came on. Like, he said good morning and good morning, good morning. But, like, that was where my voice went, right? So it's like this need to like connect with boys. And it's not like it's intentional. It's just like it happens, you know.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think particularly with men, what I find is that they want to start more with the physical. So they may be talking about more of the body, more of how they're working through their day, and more of those kind of pragmatics. When I talk to women, it's more visceral. They want to get into more of the emotional. And that's just pretty much how we're wired within the body, and the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. However, what I do find is that with men, I start on the fringes. I may start with the physical, and I may start with more of the pragmatic and how they're working through their day. But what I'll do is I'll start to work into more of the center and start to get for them to open up what is more visceral. Because really, when we think about like the trauma, if we're thinking about harm or hurt or danger or fear, that's really more the amygdala and that part of the brain that has to get to more of the feeling side. And so that we tap into that. But with men, it may be a little bit guarded. It's a new place for them. And so we do have to open that up, and I stay on fringes. And for women, they want to deep dive right into that. And I love that because it's easy.
We want to get right in there.
We want to get right in there, and that's totally fine. I'll go there. But at the same time, what I do love is that I see men coming in, as Tariq was saying, and we will match each other and we'll work together. And at some point, they'll start tapping into that. So it's beautiful.
Well, I want you guys to think about what some of the resources are that you think are available to people in this kind of pandemic. But Tony, you mentioned a word, trauma, that was also in Tariq's bio. I saw he was very intentional about using that word. And, when we think of trauma, immediately we think of something that's physical. But I know that trauma is also not only emotional, but generational. I've been working through in my own mind generational trauma with talking with my cousins about things that our parents had, that their grandparents had, that were brought to us, certain traumas. Can you talk about that at all in the Black community and what that has meant to us mentally?
Yes. So unfortunately, there's several levels of trauma, and some of my colleagues and I would say it's continuous trauma. It's these experiences that we're dealing with day to day, that level of microaggressions, just these experiences that are lived
What's a
experiences. And
microaggression?
so microaggressions are these small splinters that can happen day to day, where somebody may say something and say, "Well, oh, Dr. Span, you speak very well." And so for me, I would think, well, are you saying that because I'm a Black male and I speak very well? And for somebody, it's an intentional, maybe unintentional. They didn't know that that may be a small splinter towards me, and we consider that a microaggression. Now, for some people who live with these microaggressions every day on their job and their lives, and maybe even see those messages even at home, maybe through TV and radio. So when we think about these levels of trauma, it can get down to some of the more micro, as well as we think about the macro lived experiences for people of color that are all over the world that have to deal with oppression, colonialism, and other experiences. So that kind of trauma is either encoded in DNA sometimes, or sometimes it's currently lived and has a visceral as well as a physiological aspect.
Tariq?
Yeah. So a lot of the work around trauma began with talking about war. A lot of times when we think about trauma, it's this the person who was in combat or the person who may have been abused. But recently, I had a client who the trauma of being in an area where gunshots were dispersed it's still there, you know. So it can make the work even more difficult because it's hard to tell someone, hey, let's take 10 seconds to do some deep breathing and just focus on what the moment that you're in when that moment is the lived experience of trauma. Right? Um, it, it can really go into these strange places the more you get into trauma. Even think about myself. Could we talk about oppression? We talk about microaggression. I had an experience one time where I was stopped by police. It wasn't necessarily violent, but I was hyper aware of everything the officer did, right? Coming from the Virgin Islands, where I'm the majority, I've never felt like this direct, like this direct racism or anything like directly towards me. But as I said earlier to you, Congresswoman, I'm in Orlando right now. I'm hyper aware of the way how I navigate this space, right? So the person who walks next to me, like I walk around my neighborhood in the morning and I make sure that I am several feet away from anyone around me. So there's no reason to even assume that like I'm invading your space or even to have a slight bit of fear of me. So those things can be traumatic in of itself.
When I came out of law school and I was working, I used to do this exercise with the white guys in the office that periodically when they would come on an elevator, I would like back up against the wall and put my purse against me, like hold my purse really strong, just to give them a sense of what it feels like, for black guys coming onto an elevator, to try and flip it and let them, and then afterwards be like, how did that make you feel? That's how most black men feel, or what happens to them when they come in an elevator. But just letting them sense of that, as you said, those microaggressions that happen throughout people's day. But you guys were talking about what happens with men, the microaggressions that men feel. Are there different ones for Black women? Because I'm thinking about, in not in mental health, but in physical health, this whole notion that the high mortality rate, maternal mortality rate for Black women, and how many women are dying in childbearing. And a lot of it is equated to their concerns, what they say is wrong with their body, not being picked up by mental health, by their doctors, right? So when a Black woman comes in and says that she's not feeling well or doesn't have the words, as you said, Tariq, to express what's really going on with her, it's not really looked at, it's ignored. How do you help your colleagues understand those kinds of things, to be more in tune to what people of color are coming to them with? Are there classes? Are you working together? How does that happen?
And so, and that's a great question. And I'd like to just talk about what it is for mental health professionals as well as other people in the fields of health professions. I think it really starts with an introspective awareness and trying to identify your own personal biases. And that's where people should start in thinking about, like, where am I still working through my personal issues with other people and stereotypes and just these other forms of isms that prevent us to do our greatest work. And then particularly for Black women, as we think about some of the messages that are sent about their lived experiences, and sometimes using microaggressions towards them and saying, "Oh, you're a strong Black woman." That's true in the sense of strength, but at the same time, there's a level of vulnerability, femininity, and needing to be supported in a loving way. And so I think as we continue to talk about intersecting identities and narratives that we all hold, it's also making sure that we're honoring all parts of people and not just honing in on one narrative that makes us feel comfortable. Because sometimes we have to be in a place of not being comfortable so that we can help other people move through their discomfort as well.
Tariq, I saw you nodding.
Yeah, it gets me thinking about the many times where the female clients that I see, they're always the ones who have to define, or who are forced to define themselves as strong. Because not being strong isn't the option for the world right now, or ever really. So it's the difference between having to prepare meals, having to prepare everything. So it's just always interesting hearing I'm the person everyone in my family comes to. I'm the person that they rely on. And then I ask, like, well, what about your mom? What about your aunt? Are they typically the person that everyone relies on too? Right. And then we start to normalize the idea that, it's not an individual thing. It's not just you. We rely on women for just about everything, without giving women the space to just be, and once you get into that conversation and they're like, oh yeah, okay, so he wants to talk about that. He understands that. Then you allow space to have a deeper conversation.
Tariq, do you find what might be the differences in those kind of stereotypes or dealings that you have to do with Caribbean people? Do you see any differences in African Americans and Caribbean Americans, or even Africans living in America?
Well, so as far as being the backbone, it's across the board. Like it's all. I've always just I'm the person to rely on, whether it's African American, Caribbean American, and maybe the way how they have to navigate how they're the backbone is a bit different, but being the backbone is a common thread.
But aside from that, are there other cultural things that you find that you have to deal with differently with Caribbean people than maybe African Americans or Hispanics or anything?
Not so much. I think the biggest thing culturally that I realized, especially working back home, is when they see my hair, and it's
Really?
like, and they want to know, like, is this the super? I don't want to. I guess like the best way I can explain is this the Rastafarian guy who has this strict belief of how to look at women, how to look at the world, and then when I approach it with like this broad, let's talk about these things. They're like, oh, okay, so it's a little bit different.
Oh, because they are aware of the whole Rastafarian religion, they're wondering if that's going to inform how you. Dr. Span, do you see anything between the different culturally that you might find any nuances?
I do, and I particularly want to honor those differences, as we all have our different traditions, our different backgrounds, our different identities that help us to just make us who we are. So particularly if we're thinking about West African, if we're thinking about South African, or maybe Caribbean, as we think about certain parts of the West Indies, I make sure that that is their personal narrative. If they want to talk about traditional foods, how maybe, as you did, Congresswoman, you said your mother woke you up, and how she would tell you to get the day started. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. Even the words that you're using, it's like it's very centralized to where you're from, and it honors your mother's narrative and your narrative. So same experiences that I see, and I tease those things out, and I talk about what that means for them, so I get an understanding of who I'm working with, but multiple identities in there.
So I wanted to ask you all if you, what are some of the resources that you think people can reach into online, or services that are available during this time where you can't necessarily be in groups or have group therapy or necessarily go to you as often as we would in the normal setting? What are the resources that you would suggest to people who are watching?
Yeah, so definitely seeking clinicians who are offering telehealth services right now. So whether it's for the individual need or group needs, finding the clinician that does that. But also, and I want to stress this heavily, being really familiar with the suicide hotline, just because in this time where there's so much isolation, and then people who've been dealing with anxiety or any suicidal ideation prior to COVID-19, maybe you may not need the information for yourself, but being able to readily have that information on hand for anyone in your network.
And I'd like to also add to that, and it's another hotline, and it's almost on a little bit more severe, as well as the suicide hotline. It's the domestic violence hotline. If you need to also make sure that you call that, we're in some postures that we've never been in before, where we're in closed spaces, and we have seen a change in the shift and the uptick in some of these more intimate partner violence. And I want to say that you can always make sure that you get help with that. In addition to that, the NIMH is a National Institute of Mental Health. If you're looking for strong documents of resources, CDC. And then, as Tarek was saying, there's lots of teletherapy going on right now, and I encourage people to seek it. That's for couples counseling, family counseling, individual. I think in this time where we're home, we should try to take advantage of a lot of these resources.
Okay, so I understand you guys were given the heads up. I'm going to ask you if any books or interesting movies that you've watched during this time. So people who are at home, they might be able to look that up if you have something that you think it was, blew you away, or a movie or something that you've been reading that you want to share.
I started rewatching Game of Thrones, and then Insecure started like maybe 3 weeks ago.
Oh yeah.
But I've definitely been watching that every Sunday.
Do you relate to the characters in Insecure at all? I know that's your age group, Tariq. They're a little young for me, so.
I mean, it's definitely an interesting show. I like the different dynamics. I think super interesting is highlighting what toxic relationships between friends can look like. Having a conversation about when it's time to cut those relationships off has been super interesting. And then as far as books, so prior to all of this and being like shut in, I was reading a whole lot of mental health books, books on colonialism, and I found that I kind of kicked out all of my fiction. So recently I started to reread Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone with my stepson.
So you're a fantasy kind of person.
Oh yes. So
I got a couple of authors I'm gonna send to you, Tariq. I'll text you.
Looking forward to it.
I before you go, Dr. Span, I love the movie Game of Thrones, but for Game of Thrones fans who have not read the books, I feel a kind of way. because I read all of the books way before the movies were started. But I'm a spoiler, Tariq. You know, you've already seen them, but I will tell you what the ending is as you're watching it if you haven't read the books.
Seeing a whole bunch, the ending was awful.
But if you read the books, it makes complete sense that it comes full circle, that the legacy of the Starks does endure, right?
Yeah, I guess it was more because of the production of it. It rushed through, but I guess for another time.
Dr. Span?
Yeah, and just kind of adding to that, I guess there's a little bit of similarity with Tyreek. I am watching Insecure, and that's actually a show that I really enjoy. It's really right at the heartbeat of my generation, and I kind of echo a lot of what's going on in the scenes, and just thinking about the complexities of intimacy and living through the different experiences. So I'm right on with that one. And then for me, I'm doing a lot more listening to music. So I'm listening back to Frankie Beverly and Maze and kind of tapping into some LPs. So that's really cool.
Wait, are you from the DMV area?
No, I'm not originally from the DMV. My family's a military family, so I lived all over, and I was born in Louisiana, so I just kind of have a taste of home for everywhere.
Okay, because I find that people from the DMV love Frankie Beverly and Maze.
They do, and I love that because that means he comes here with the band, and I get to catch him all the time. So I'm not mad at it. But you're right. Like I was like, there's a big following here, so I'm right at home with that. So thank you for pointing that out. And the other thing I was going to say, Congresswoman, is that I've been reading a book called The Tao of Pooh. It's actually more pronounced Tao of Pooh, but Tao of Pooh, it's Taopooh. So it's really about Pooh Bear and his family and friends, but at the same time, Tao is actually a particularly type of mantra and way of being where it's harmony, kind of meditations. And it's really what I've been looking into and kind of finding meditations, as Tariq was saying, and using that with my clients and myself, and using that at Henry Health and providing meditation. So it's been the next step in my kind of journey as a practitioner.
Interesting. So I want everyone to know that I recently this week watched the new documentary, Basketball County, that talks about PG County and the prevalence of amazing NBA players that have come out of the county, and really the backdrop for why that happened. The crack epidemic pushing the county to have these all-night, 24-hour basketball courts, and the influence of go-go music on even how the players move from that area. If you watch Kevin Durant and some of the moves that he makes, is really very in tune with go-go music. And then I always have my kids watch with me the evolution of hip hop, to explain to them that their mother really was there back in the day and they ain't got nothing on me. And I have been rereading The Audacity to Win, which was written by David Plouffe and is the history of how Obama decided to run and his race for the White House. And I think I just feel like it's really timely right now. So, gentlemen, thank you. You have blessed me this Saturday morning. Thank you for your work. I know that this is a difficult time for all of us. And thank you all for taking on our community and shouldering so much of the burden that we all have. Thank you for making yourselves available. And I'm going to be praying for you, and blessings to you and your family for all that you do. So thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful, it's a long weekend. Everybody go out, grill, be on the beach, whatever you have to do, but let's do it with social distancing and keeping our health in mind.
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend, guys.
Okay.